Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bazaar Overexplained. And today we have a very special video where we're going to be looking at the archetypes here for Vanessa. So with the different archetypes on Vanessa, we are going to be covering 6 major and core archetypes, I would say, that Vanessa has access to, and then 2 special guests that are kind of more corner cases, as we'll see. The purpose of this video more so is to give you a broader idea of what you should be looking for on Vanessa, and ultimately, when you're in your games, giving you the option or just the knowledge to be able to pivot between the builds and know what items you should be looking for when going for each of your builds. And as a quick point of clarification here, when I'm saying archetypes, I'm saying the macro level strategies that are in the game, when the different items are going to fall into one of these different categories here for Vanessa. And when I say builds, that's the actual items that you're putting on board and kind of the target amalgamation of items that you're looking for in your games. Now, why don't we start with the weapon spam archetype? When we're talking about weapon spam, I'm talking about a build like this. We can see from this user here, Spaghetti, who had posted their build into the Bazaar Discord. They have kind of a smattering of all these different types of weapons, and they're trying to basically put as much damage onto the board as possible. And really the big thing here is they're also trying to really leverage the skills that they to get them to that 10-win victory. We can see the Shark Claws here at Diamond 2. We have some Obsidian upgrades and things of this nature, but the damage is the name of the game. We can see another example of this from user Jackson, something of the nature. My apologies, I don't know how to pronounce your name thoroughly here, but utilizing something like katanas and switchblade, just trying to put on the most amount of damage here. But this item here, again, Shark Claws, is something that we're seeing that's going to pop up pretty consistently in these builds. Again, we see all these crit skills, these damage-based skills that we're putting onto our items. Now let's talk about how we get there. So let's look at some key items that are part of this weapons build. So we see Shark Claws, Katana, Pet Rock, and Shadow Cloak being kind of the cornerstones in this build. And when we're talking about this weapon spam build, we're also really talking about a build that is very flexible, but ultimately it is kind of an archetype, meaning that although we can have very similar weapons on board each game, we are generally just talking about a kind of style of play that you can do. And that again revolves around putting a bunch of weapons on the board. So what synergizes with that very well? Well, we see something like Shark Claws. Shark Claws is a really powerful weapon because it ultimately allows you to go very wide on your board with all of your small weapons or medium weapons. You can buff them up periodically whenever the Shark Claws goes off. So just taking a quick look at the Shark Claws and how this would work, we see that whenever the Shark Claws goes off, it's going to give all our other weapons a large amount of damage. So we can imagine the wider we go on our board, the more powerful this Shark Claws effect is going to be. Thus, the Shark Claws is a huge enabler for our weapon spam build, and as we can see, it is an item that we can get in, or at the bronze tier, I should say. So we can get this pretty early. We can utilize the guaranteed level ups that we're going to get throughout the day that are going to allow us to upgrade weapons to even upgrade our Shark Claws early and often and ensure that we're putting as much damage on the board as wide and as fast as possible as we can. That damage works really well with an item like the Katana. The big draw of the Katana here is that it has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, cooldown of any weapon in the game at 2 seconds. So this thing is going off so quickly, and thus if you're putting any sorts of damage stacking on it, it's going to get a huge buff and it's going to deal a lot of damage to your opponent. And the item that you predominantly want to combo or put alongside this to synergize with is a Shadowed Cloak. Now with the Shadow Cloak, it says that when you use the item to the right of this, you haste it for however many seconds depending on the level, and you give it damage. So when you're putting it next to a katana, the katana is being hasted pretty much permanently for the rest of the fight, unless it is being slowed or frozen, and thus it's going off every single second, and it's going to be doing that damage. It's also going to be scaling the damage from the Shadow Cloak that it's receiving as well. And one of the big things about the Shadow Cloak is that you can't buy it directly from Vanessa's shops, but what you can do is get it from each of these different monsters that you fight throughout the day. One of the most important ones that we'll see here is actually the Covetous Thief. So here are the items for the Covetous Thief. We can see that they provide the Shadow Cloak. They also have the Grindstone, but the most important thing here is that they're available on day 2. And if we go and see what monsters are available at day 2, you either have the choice of Covetous Thief or the Warrior, so you have a 50% chance of fighting the Covetous Thief to begin with, and thus, if you know you have a pretty good start to a weapons build, you can fight the Covetous Thief, and you have a pretty decent chance of getting the Shadow Cloak, and even if you don't get the Shadow Cloak, there's still something like Sharpening Stone that can put damage onto your weapons, Grindstone to work well with your weapons, you can get Crit Chance, even this Pickpocket skill, all are very viable on Vanessa. And maybe the least important but not the least powerful item that generally goes along with all of these weapons is the Pet Rock. The Pet Rock is very important because it's going to give all of your items crit chance. And I want you to think about this. If you have no crit chance on your board, you will never crit. But if you have at least 10% crit chance, you will crit 10% of the time. You are effectively adding the option for your weapons to deal that double damage, and that in its own right is very important in the game. Again, even putting 1% crit chance on your weapon, just having the opportunity to crit can win you fights where you may have not had the opportunity to do so before. So again, Pet Rock, maybe not the most important, but it can be potentially the most potent as it's so efficient in that it's giving you damage, so it's scaling with your Shark Claws, and it's also giving you a really large amount of crit if you can get it to Diamond. So now that we've talked about the key weapons, I want to talk about some of the key skills. So which skills we're looking for is going to be pretty obvious in some regards, but it's going to be damage and it's going to be crit chance. So things like strength, which adds damage to our items, left or right-handed, which adds damage to one item, honed arsenal that's going to give you crit based off the amount of weapons that you have on board. We have keen eye that gives flat crit chance. We have the best defense, which is giving you weapons more damage every time an adjacent weapon goes off, and then noisy cricket that are going to be ultimately giving your weapons more damage across the board if you have over a certain threshold of them. But let's look at those skills. So looking at a skill like strength, we can see that this is something that we can get at the bronze tier, and it's also something that we can get as a gold starting skill. So having the opportunity to get this early means we're going to be putting a lot of damage onto our board. We can also see that there are 5 different monster fights that have the strength skill, and again, for every weapon that we have on board, we're adding on this damage to it, and thus again, the name of the game here is to put as much of the damage on the board as fast as possible and as wide as possible. And again, we've talked about damage, but here's crit chance. Crit chance and damage, it goes together like peanut butter and jelly if you're into that sort of thing. But having crit chance on your weapons is what is going to allow you to go over the top of your opponents as we scale into the later portions of the game. One weakness of this build is that it ultimately is not going to scale super effectively into the later portions of the game. We're really trying to collect our wins before our opponents have the ability to get all of their max HP up higher than the threshold of where we can burst them down. So to do that, we're taking advantage of characters like Mac, who have a very low starting max HP. We're taking advantage of characters like Dooley, who can take a little bit of time to get online and ramp their damage, and we're trying to burst them down. Or with Pygmalion, who may not have the opportunity again to go very quickly with their build or have a very strong build in the early days. We're trying to guarantee that we can kill them as early and as often as possible. And again, the huge part of that is this crit chance. So if we're trying to get ahead and stay ahead, then at the start of the game, what are we doing? So we can think about it in a couple different ways here. We could try and high roll a gold tier skill, like that strength skill or that keen eye skill, to add more crit chance on our board, but really we would really want a damage skill more than all of those, so we could also be looking for something like left-handed or right-handed, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. We could also look at some enchanted items and hope that we get a enchanted weapon, but also we could know that if we're going to be looking for weapons here, we're going to need gold, and we're going to need income specifically. The nice thing about the weapons build is it is very consistent. You don't necessarily need the shark claws to make it work. You don't necessarily need the katana to make it work. You can find a smattering of weapons, find some good skills, and just be pumping out more damage than your opponents have prepared for you. So really you could choose all of these, but just understanding the downsides of them all is very important. If we get a gold tier skill, we may not be offered that weapon skill in those first starting 3, so we're going to have to pivot to a different build. And the same here for this enchanted item build. We may not get a good weapon to start with. So normally what I like to do if I'm going this build is I'm starting with that 12 gold and 2 income. So just fast forwarding here to the end of the first day, what do we do when we're looking for these weapons? Well, we found a katana. We also found a bayonet. So every time this katana goes off, it's doing an extra 10 damage. We also found the Zorsid, which is going to be hasting our katana and doing some damage itself. We got this train skill, so we know that slowing is ultimately going to be something good for us. And we also had the opportunity to pick up a few chocolates here and a smattering of other weapons. So with this, if we're facing a Mac, we know that they have 200 HP, so however we can burst them down and with that as fast as possible is probably the name of the game. We don't have anything to enable our katana, but even putting Shoe Blade and Bolas on board could be pretty nice here. Bolas does a lot of burst damage, so that could be the correct play too. But if we're thinking about katana and its cooldown again here, so we have the Shoe Blades going off every 7 seconds to do 20, and with our katana, it would have gone off at least 3 times by then. With the bayonet, that's going to represent more damage. And then we would just want to figure out if we were to replace the Zorsid. I think hasting the katana is going to be pretty good here. I also had the opportunity to pick up some chocolate bars, which is very important on Vanessa. If you're ahead and you ultimately are not doing anything synergy based, you're going to want to be ahead on HP so that you don't get bursted down when you're trying to burst down your opponents. So I'm going to fast forward here for us to look at the mid game, where ultimately we're kind of in the middle portion of the days here. We're fighting different opponents. We kind of our build coming together here. We see that we've leveraged this katana to, again, with our Zorsid and with our bayonet, to ultimately utilize the shark claws alongside it to put a lot of damage onto that katana and a lot of haste. We've also found an axe, which allows us to pump up our damage. And we also see that we have like a beach ball here where this is hasting all of our different aquatic items. So this is guaranteed going to haste the shark claws, which is a really big deal here as it puts more and more damage onto our board. And this is actually from a pre-recorded run where I ended up utilizing this to, I think, get 8 or 9 wins. So we'll talk about the weaknesses here in a second, but just know that if you're going to be going for this weapon spam build, you're also going to be having to figure out a way to win in the end game. And going back to those original builds that we looked at that got that 10 win victory, we can see that that build that I just showed you could turn into something like this, where we have this obsidian upgrade on the katana, so it's doing a lot of damage. We have the golden shark claws. Again, we have Vanessa's amulet that's giving more crit chance to her board, with the pet rock that's creating a ton of crit, along with this keen-eyed skill and all of our other crit chance skills. So this board is doing a lot of damage, more damage than it looks, just because of how much it is going to be critting their opponents. So with this, the weapons build and the weapon spam build is probably one of the, I want to say easiest, but at least the most consistent builds that you can pull up on Vanessa to try and win your 10 wins in the Bazaar. So the next build I want to talk about is one weapon builds. And as we can see here from this player here, Sir Adam V or Sir Adam V, it is just as it says, we are using one weapon here to basically leverage and utilize in our runs. There's a couple different variants of this build, but we're going to see that there's a lot of commonalities in the items that we're going to want to pick up. Namely here, we're looking for something like this crow's nest. So looking over those items here, we do see that crow's nest here, which says that if you have one weapon, it ultimately is going to get lifesteal, and it's also going to statically give crit chance across your board, the crow's nest. But what are we going to be doing with that crow's nest? Well, we're going to be looking for one weapon to go alongside it. And two of the premier ones, I would say, are the cutlass and the flagship. The cutlass is going to be a 2x multicast item that has a very high % crit chance property. It's going to also, or it doesn't have innate crit rather, but it does double crit damage. We're also going to be looking for something like a silencer that reduces the cooldowns of our one weapons if we have one weapon. It also puts a damage buff on that weapon. We could utilize something like the flagship, which will have a high multicast and can, if you have the right items, go off 4 or 5 times. And this is a great way to pump out a lot of damage and proc with synergistically with something like a shadowed cloak or even something like a sextant. And as we can see from the sextant here, it is an item that has innate crit chance that it gives to your item. And whenever you crit with that item, it is going to haste that. So let's look at these things. So first off is our silencer here, which, as we can see, gives the weapon to the left of this a static amount of damage. And then also if you have exactly one weapon, it reduces its cooldown. So the obvious synergy here is we see this one weapon clause, and utilizing that one weapon, we can make something like that cutlass or that flagship go down in its cooldown. Which again, if we look at like a flagship here, if we have a tool, property, friend, or ammo item, it has +1 multicast and it has a static amount of damage. The downside here is the flagship can be a little slow. It is starting at 7 seconds is when it starts to go off, and we would need to have the necessary ammo item or friend item, property item, or tool item to go along with it, which is not the most trivial, I will say. You're generally going to want to also look for something like dive weights, which is both a tool and an ammo item, so it ticks 2 of those boxes. And again, if we look at crow's nest here, so the crow's nest, if you exactly have one weapon, that weapon has lifesteal, and this is going to be a huge source of your crit chance. It is going to give all of your weapons crit chance, so you don't necessarily need to use it in one weapon build, but giving up this lifesteal is a pretty big downside. But if you have all this crit chance, you can use it with something like the sextant, which gives a static amount of crit chance, but it also hastes items when you crit. So this can be a pretty good source of hasting. As we saw before, the Shadow Cloak, definitely a good item for builds that are trying to utilize one weapon or a smattering of weapons. So this item is again very flexible and pretty desirable on Vanessa. So what skills are we looking to enable our one weapon builds? Well, there's a lot of different ones that we can choose from. Those generic ones that give you both damage and strength are pretty good, but we can look for ones that are more specific to a one weapon item. We can look for something like tempering, which is going to give you more damage, big numbers, which is going to give you more crit chance, crashing waves, which will give you haste, and quality over quantity that'll give you lifesteal. So starting with big numbers, this says that your large items have +25 or +50% crit chance. This is something that you can obtain from the Property Baron on the day 10 fights. They do have this skill, or it's something that you can naturally get from Vanessa. It ultimately is going to synergize well with obviously your large items, but it's something that you're going to be wanting to kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're looking at those later fights to know which skills you're trying to maximize and which skills that you're trying to ultimately get from the monsters that you're facing. And looking at that skill tempering here, we can see that it says when you use a weapon, it gains 3, 6, 9, or 9 damage for the fight, depending on the rarity that it's at. So from this, if we're thinking about, again, something like flagship, every time that it's going off, every one of those multicasts counts as a separate time that we're using the weapon. So if we are having a silver tier tempering skill and we have a flagship that is going off 5 times, it's going to get +15 damage, and notably it's going to see those iterations of it. So it's going to get +3 damage every single time. So it is stacking that damage as you're using the item and as it's going off. So pretty important skill there. And we talked about how the crow's nest is really important, but what if we want to take the crow's nest off the board? It's ultimately 3 slots of our board, and it's not adding anything on a stats basis outside of its crit chance and lifesteal. But what if we want to put even more items onto our board? Well, we can find this skill here that is also innate to Vanessa at the gold tier rarity, and it is quality over quantity. It says if you have exactly one weapon, it has lifesteal and crit chance. So this is effectively going to replace that crow's nest. The only thing is that we generally have to have built up enough either items or other skills to make up for the crit chance that we're losing when we take the crow's nest off the board. And we talk about the damage portion of it, but how do we get our build up and running? Well, crashing waves is a great skill here. Again, at gold tier for Vanessa. This has seen a couple different iterations, but it says the first 5 or 10 times you use an aquatic weapon, or aquatic item rather, each fight, haste one weapon for 1 second. So if we're using something like the captain's wheel, we are using an aquatic item that's going to haste our one weapon, and this is going to give it another point of haste in case we have like a silver captain's wheel or gold captain's wheel. Because it would have a 2.5 second cooldown, there is that 0.5 seconds at gold tier where it won't be hasting that item. So if we want to have perma haste on the item, we can utilize that. Or if we just want to use other aquatic items that aren't necessarily synergizing with our one weapon, that crashing wave skill is going to allow us to still have haste on our board, regardless of if we were hasting that item directly with something like a captain's wheel. So, going back to our example here from Sir Adam, we can see that they have this flagship. They're hastening it with this captain's wheel. They also have this potion here that's going to give it 100% crit chance. They also have a friend here. This is ultimately just to enable the fact that we can get this to plus or ×5 multicast on our flagship, and they have the crow's nest. It also looks like they have the obsidian upgrade on our crow's nest and the radiant on their captain's wheel here. So this is always going to be hasting, and this is doing an insane amount of damage. We can also see some haste enabling skills here, some fire synergies where they're putting on fire. One other thing here to talk about is that they have these 2 freeze skills here. Freeze can be very important in the late game, thinking about if you're facing either another one weapon build, or if you're facing a Pygmalion, or just any other build that's ultimately going to be a little bit slower. Freezing their items can make all the difference, and it can be the thing that allows you to win the fights when you otherwise would not. So with the one weapon build, there's a lot of ways to do it, but a lot of them are going to end up looking like this. We could have replaced this with a sextant. We could have also put a cutlass in the mix here, and those would still have been very effective. But a lot of this does come down to getting the crow's nest or getting something like silencer to make that one weapon build really come together. I do also just want to talk about a quick vulnerability of the one weapon build here, and that is namely builds that are going to disrupt it, like the dually bug build. Now, this is me playing Mac the other day, but ultimately this is the build that can give you a lot of problems if you're on a one weapon build. You are having very few targets for the blue beetle and very few targets for the black spider. So basically all of those are going to go on your weapon. And unless you get a radiant weapon, there's not much you can do. And the enchantments, we can't really control the enchantments that we're going to get. So this build can outright counter you. You can just get permanently locked out by the blue beetle, permanently slowed by the black spider. So with the one weapon build where the meta's at currently, although it can be powerful, you really have to get the synergies to come together early, and you're also going to want to be dodging a lot of these more disruptive builds that we see in the meta. So the next build I want to talk about is the aquatic weapons build, or kind of like this haste slow weapons build. What this is primarily trying to do is take advantage of something like the shark ray or the old salt claw to scale up an incredibly large amount of damage through its hasting and slowing procs that the shark ray sees, and kind of scale a weapon that is going to ultimately either 2-shot or 1-shot your opponent. This build is, as we see from Credinus, one that can look very different in a lot of different scenarios. It really is revolving around something like the shark ray, so it's not as consistent as some of the other options that Vanessa has. There are a lot of haste and slow items that you can utilize to leverage in the meantime before you can find a shark, or you can try and just use the old salt claw, which is worse than the shark ray, but will still get the job done. There are different ways to, again, make this build, but ultimately we're looking for kind of like something like this, where we're having shot glasses, where we're haste and slowing. We have dive weights, where we're putting a lot of haste on our board and things of this nature. Here's another example from one of my runs. Basically that run that we're actually looking at when we were at day 5, we are now looking at what this turned into. And just for reference, here's that build again where we had both the beach ball and the shark claws, just kind of a smattering of weapons here. And that build turned into this, where we were taking the Shark Claw, and you can see it has over 1200 damage on it. We have Turbo Shark Claws, here we have the Shark Ray rather, we have Turbo Shark Claws, we have the Beach Ball at Gold, so it's hasting all of our things. We have the Zoricid here, which is also providing another means of haste that the Shark Ray is then seeing to put on a very large amount of scaling damage. And just a third example here from this user, Utobi here, is a much more all-in Shark Ray build where they're just putting on tons and tons and tons and tons of haste so that their Shark Ray rather is going to get as big as it can. They have a silencer here even to reduce its cooldown, and ultimately they have it enchanted with shielding here so that it's providing a little bit of defense along with its offense. So our key items here, as we saw, the Shark Ray and the old Saw Claw are kind of the bread and butter. They are enablers. They are ultimately the damage dealers that we're going to be utilizing for this build. Sea Dog Saloon is what can provide us a lot of haste and slow, as well as shot glasses here. And then there's also something like Zoricid, which we can get pretty early on. That's going to provide a good amount of haste, give us some good burn synergies if we find something like an elemental depth charge or something of the nature that can give us a lot of burn. Thus, the Zoricid can give us a lot of haste. So ultimately, we would want to assemble maybe all of these items, but we also know that we're probably only going to get only a few of these, so we have to be flexible. So diving into these items, we have the Shark Ray, the one that we've seen the most and highlighted the most here for this build. It says when you haste, this gains either 20, 40, or 60 damage based off its rarity. It has a 7-second cooldown, so this is kind of a pro and con. It's going to see a lot of your hastes that have happened, but it in itself is going to be going off pretty slowly. Thus, because it's going off pretty slowly, it's probably going to be hasted itself. It's not always the most reliable of weapons, so you generally have to have something alongside it to either keep you alive or something else defensive to ensure that it is be able to go off when it gets to that 1200 2000 plus damage territory. And again, its analog here is the old Salt Claw, which has a 6-second cooldown. It's a small item, and it says when you haste or slow, this gains 5, 10, or 15 damage. So it's not scaling nearly as fast or nearly as big as a Shark Claw, but it sees that we are counting both haste and slow, which can be pretty big for us. So when we're utilizing something like shot glasses, we see that this is hasting and slowing our items for 1 second. The big important thing about this is that for every item that it hastes or slows, this is going to be another instance or a separate instance of that haste and slow. So basically for each one item when we have the old Saw Claw on the board that is affected by shot glasses, we're going to get 2 procs onto our old Saw Claw. So that can scale its damage pretty nicely. And then this is affecting our board, and we probably want to take this off our board at some point, but we can see that it does scale well into the late game if we have the right items. But one big thing that is not affecting our items, but instead slowing our opponent's items, is the Sea Dog Saloon. And this one is pretty nice because it has +1 multicast for each friend that we have. The Salt Claw and the Shark Ray are both friends, so when they are on the board with the Sea Dog Saloon, the Sea Dog Saloon is going off more, and we can see that it's hasting and slowing our item, or slowing their opponent's items, but hasting our items, and thus this is kind of what you would really rather be doing with your slowing here. And then when we're bridging the gap, we are looking for this Zoricid. It is a haste item in its own right, and it also says when you burn, charge just 1 second. We can utilize things like pop snappers or the volcanic vents to enable this to go off much more quickly, and this can bridge the gap until we get our ideal aquatic damage, hasting and slowing items. We could even be looking for something like a shipwreck, which synergizes very well with our items here. It does have this downside where it increases our items cooldowns by 2 and 1 second depending on its rarity, but it also gives our item +1 multicast. So you can imagine a Shark Ray or an old Saw Claw that's going off twice every time is pretty powerful. And with that, there's a lot of different ways to flex with this build. It's one of the more harder builds to pull off, but I think it's pretty fun when you can actually get everything all together. And in terms of skills, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically anything that you can get that's going to be hasting your weapons, especially crashing waves, is going to be the name of the game here. You can get damage, you can get crit chance and everything of that nature, but truly, however we can put the most haste onto our board is what we're going to do. So with that, if you want to see all the haste skills, you can go to howbazaar.gg. You can search in the skills here. You can actually click on this little filters button. You can go to Vanessa and click haste, and then you can see that there's 10 skills that mention that. And these are all the haste skills that you can get. So going back to our example here, we can see that with this build, it is slow. Yes, we are hasting. Yes, that would imply that it goes quickly, but the problem is that we're hasting and that is going to be ramping our damage. The shark ray has to see all those instances of haste. So it innately is only starting at 74 damage here. As we can see that this player, they were level 14. So I want to say that they were probably on day maybe 12 or 13 when they won. They had taken some losses on the way. We can know that because they didn't get a diamond tier victory. But regardless, it takes some time to ramp this up. And also, they are really relying on a crit from the shark ray to do all this damage. You're also scaling its damage with this skill here. It says when you haste an item, if it's already hasted, it gains damage. So basically, we're just taking some time for this to get off the ground. Again, if we have an opponent disrupting us, which we see a lot of in the meta right now, or someone who's stacking on like a ton of damage very quickly from a burst build from Vanessa, or maybe we're looking at like a Mac who's doing a lot of poison damage or fire damage very quickly, it's not guaranteed that this build is going to go off. It is very strong, and it is one of the builds that can do the most damage possible on Vanessa just because of how the shark ray scales. But regardless, this is it's good to know that this has some strengths and weaknesses. So the next build to look at here is the burn build on Vanessa. And I'm not going to lie to you, this one is not the easiest to pull off, but there are some supportive synergies with it that can allow us to get there. Namely here, we can look at an item like pop snappers, and how it synergizes with this item here, the powder keg. We can see this volcanic flask. So there are a lot of ways to burn, but really it's this powder keg here that's going to be the name of the game. We can see that Mr. Munchkin here has this diamond powder keg that's going to do a tremendous amount of damage to the opponents, and it's going to be going off very quickly and get charged every time that they burn. Looking at something like volcanic vents here, which has 3 times multicast, and it's a burn item, it's going to get this powder keg to go off pretty quickly. And here's another example. This is one of the runs that I was doing the other day, and it is an example of how we can, again, utilize that powder keg, but also put some other synergies onto our board. I was able to start with this fiery Zoracid here that allowed itself to be charged. This is only day 4 here, so it's not the most optimal board, but it's getting us in the right direction. We have a very powerful means of burst damage. We have the volcanic vents. We have the incendiary rounds. It's burning every time that the adjacent items are being used. And we have the javelin here, which is being reloaded every time we haste, and thus the Zoracid is going off, which is enabling this javelin to be reloaded. So yeah, this is a mid-game version of this build. We can see that on day 4, we got a lot of the pieces online pretty quickly, and this does do a lot of damage, but how we scale this into the late game is where things get more tricky. We're going to need a lot more skills to get there, as we saw in our example, but we can ultimately get a lot of these enabling pieces pretty early on. So looking at the key items for this build here, we see a lot of the ones that we saw in these examples. So the volcanic vents, it's having that 3 times multicast, so just many instances of burn. The incendiary rounds allows us to essentially turn maybe something like a pearl or something that's going off very quickly into a burn item. And also with that, that'll charge our Azoricid, that'll charge our Powder Keg, which are big sources of damage here from this Powder Keg. You can also see something that's doing a lot of fire damage, like a dark water anglerfish, which it in itself says that every time you slow, you charge this item, and it has a pretty good amount of burn on it. Let's take a closer look at these items. So here's the big one. Here's Powder Keg. It has a 20-second cooldown, which is pretty crazy, but it says when you burn, you charge this every 2 seconds. And the big thing here is that it deals damage equal to your opponent's max health, which is pretty nuts. So it's going to scale and be good at pretty much every iteration of the game. But the thing that you really want to do with this is put crit chance on it. And crit chance says that you are doing double damage. So if we see that we are doing 50% of our opponent's max health, well, double that is 100%. So we are doing the entirety of our opponent's max health as damage. The problem is that sometimes they can have shielding and things of this nature. However, we're also doing a lot of burn damage with our other items, so chances are that when the powder keg goes off, even if it doesn't finish them, just the amount of burn damage that we're putting on our opponents can be enough to get us across the finish line. And that other burn enabler here that does a lot of damage, that dark water anglerfish, it has an 8-second cooldown comparatively, and says when you slow, you charge this every 2 seconds. So the big thing here is that it has 10, 20, and 30 burn. These are not small numbers in terms of burn, and keep in mind when it says when you slow charges 2 seconds, that means every iteration of slow. So if we look at something like dock lines, this says it's going to be slowing 2, 3, or 4 items every 3 seconds. So if we have like a diamond tier dock lines, it slows 4 items. That's 4 instances of slow that the dark water anglerfish sees. So then it just goes off. And there's many slow items on Vanessa here. We can also see something that can synergize well with it, like this lighthouse here, where it is also saying when you slow charge this 2 seconds. So if you have the anglerfish and you have the lighthouse and you have a bunch of instances of slow, you're going to be doing a ton of burn. But more straightforwardly, we can look at the volcanic vents, which is just a 3 times multicast item at 7 seconds that does burn damage. However, if we put like a gold tier burn skill or something on this, we find ways to stack up that burn, it's going to be pretty good. It's also works in combination again with something like that incendiary rounds, these incendiary rounds here, which says when you use an adjacent item, burn 1, 2, or 3. It's not a large amount of burn, but again, if we put it next to like a multicasting item, it's going to see every time that that item goes off as a separate instance, so it's going to burn for every multicast essentially. Or if we're putting it next to something that has a low cooldown, like let's say that pearl, which is going to be going off whenever we use an aquatic item, we can get a lot of instances of burn here and then charge our powder keg. There's many other synergies here, but there's also just some good items to look out for. So it wasn't a key item here, but we can see something like a pop snappers that has a 4-second cooldown with 3 ammo and does a pretty decent amount of burn. This is something that can kind of help you get off the ground in the early game, but also doing 8 burn on a 4-second cooldown is no small amount. So if you have if you can find a way to keep reloading this pop snappers, that is a pretty good way to be burning out your opponents in the mid game. And we can also look at something like the lighter, which has a 3-second cooldown, so it's very quick, and then it does these different portions of burn here. So not going to be what we want late game. However, it is a source of burn that we can use in combination with the burn skill to put a pretty decent amount of burn on in the mid game. So I won't also spend too much time on it, but I would like to look at some of the skills here. And you can imagine basically anything that says burn is something that we're going to be looking out for. We can look at like conflagration. It says when you use an item with burn, this item gets 1, 2, or 3 burn for the fight. That works very well with our volcanic vents. We can get something like a final flame very early on from like our gold tier skill option at the very beginning and put +6 burn on our volcanic vent, which is very strong. Putting more burn on something like fiery is very good. And also don't underestimate these freeze skills. Freeze again can be just so important in the game. You want to be picking these up if it's basically not your highest priority, but if you have the option to pick up a free skill, definitely do so. It's only going to help you. And I will say, there are a lot of these skills that say like when you crit, your burn items gain plus burn, or if you burn, you gain more crit and that sort of thing. Those are good in the build, but I want us to also think about how our burn damage is stacking onto our opponents. So if we're building up a lot of burn, and we're putting on a lot of instances very quickly, we're not really taking full advantage of the critical skills here that are scaling. We're not putting on like a huge amount of damage or something like that where we want to one-shot our opponent. We're putting on a lot of small instances of burn, which does charge these skills up pretty nicely. However, we're maybe putting on, like, instead of 4 burn, we're putting on 8 burn or something like that. So they're not absolutely necessary to your build. I would prioritize the static burn item or the static burn skills if you can do that over getting something that's going to be building up. But these are still definitely good to have. Putting more crit chance on your board is never a bad thing. So taking a look at our example here again for Mr. Munchkin, they have this diamond tier powder keg that's going off very quickly because they have these incendiary rounds that with this 3-second pop snappers, that's going to be going off very quickly. They have the dive weights that is going off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Thus the incendiary rounds are seeing each one of those 5 different instances as a separate point of burn. They have the volcanic vents here that's going off 3 times. So this powder keg goes off very quickly. But notably, they have a lot of crit chance. So they have Vanessa's amulet here. They also have, I believe, the left eye skill here. They have inexorable. So they've been stacking up a lot of crit onto their board. And we can see that they're level 19 here. So they were going into the pretty late game here. I don't know exactly which day that they had won on, or that they reached their 10 wins, but I imagine it was maybe like day 15 or 16 or something of that nature, unless they really high rolled a lot of XP events and monsters and stuff like that. But the big thing here is that once they have this build up and running, they're basically able to one-shot their opponents if they get this powder keg to crit and crit very quickly. So very cool build. And yeah, the burn build, not always easy to put together, but when you do put it together, it can be very explosive. So the next build I want to talk about is Aquatic Poison. And if you played in the open beta times before Season 1, this build's going to look very familiar to you. Essentially, we are using items like the pufferfish and the catfish to put on tons and tons of poison onto our opponents. We generally are having some sort of haste enabler to make sure that our pufferfish is going off as fast as possible. In the late game, we're looking for something like a shipwreck, which will give 2 times multicast to all of our items. And other than that, we are just hasting as much as possible. This build is not as powerful as it was before, I will say. We're living in the world where Mac is going to do probably more poison than you are realistically as Vanessa. They're also putting on way more burn damage than you can handle. And if we think about how poison and burn ticks, so burn damage is going to be going off essentially twice a second, while poison damage is going off every 1 second. So burn damage is much quicker in killing your opponents. And also, if you don't have any defenses as Vanessa, which if you're in an aquatic build, you might have a seaweed or something like that. You can see maybe this pearl here could be stopping that. But generally speaking, you're going to be wanting to go and haste your items as much as possible. So your defenses can't make up all the way for the fact that your opponents are putting on crazy numbers of poison and burn on you. Additionally, we see something like the Dually Friends build where they have a ton of slow and a ton of freezing that can disrupt your hasting and your pufferfish from going off. Yes, this pufferfish is really big, but this really does run the risk of being countered by other builds here. However, it is still very potent, and it can go straight through something like a Pygmalion who's using a fixer-upper to get a bunch of shielding on themselves. If we are looking at a Mac that is maybe trying to go more survivability focused, you are going to be able to outpoison and outdamage them every time. The regen builds on Mac can be very scary, but the numbers that you put on from sheer poisoning from Vanessa can go over the top of that. However, it just isn't as strong as it was before Season 1, so just keep that in mind. It's still very potent, but it does take some finesse. as we can see here from this Discord user, Shoni, who got this 10 wins to pull it off. And congratulations, they did it. So let's look at our key items here. As we were talking about, pufferfish is generally one of the biggest enablers that we can be utilizing for this build, where it says that it's going to be charged every time you haste, and it itself is going to be doing poison damage. Catfish is going to be basically gaining more poison every time it's haste. We have a haste enablers like the water wheel that are going to haste all of your items on the board. Jellyfish itself, when it is next to an item that is aquatic and it goes off, the jellyfish gets hasted, which the pufferfish sees. But thinking about all of this and how poison works, we're ultimately going to need some source of sustainability. And with sustainability, there's very few items that are better than seaweed. Seaweed is one of the most potent healing items, if not the most potent healing item in the game for being a one-slot item. And it is something that can stack up just an incredible amount of healing. So starting with the seaweed, we can see that it is a 7-second cooldown. It says whenever you use an aquatic item in general, this gains plus healing. So this can be a really nice source of survivability in the early and mid game. And it's also something that we can see that if you enchant it with like obsidian, toxic, or fiery, it can put out a tremendous amount of damage too. I've certainly been killed by many obsidian seaweeds. A little offense, a little defense goes a long way, especially when you're utilizing some low cooldown items like Pearl or hasting your items on Vanessa. And speaking of hasting items, one enabler here that we saw as a key item is a water wheel. So this says you haste your other items for 2 seconds, and when you use an adjacent item, charge this 2 seconds. So if we can get this water wheel off, it's going to be hasting all of our items, which is really going to put our build over the top. What's going to synergize super well with it is something like the pufferfish, which says when you haste, charge this 2 seconds. And again, it's going to see the instances of haste that the water wheel provides, so the pufferfish can go off very, very quickly. But we also see something like the catfish, which says when this gains haste, it gains additional poison. And then a 5-second cooldown, this catfish can do some incredible things. Not only does it synergize well with the water wheel, but we also saw another build here that's synergizing very well with the captain's wheel, which we put it alongside it. The captain's wheel is then hasting the catfish directly and thus scaling it up with a tremendous amount of poison. And it would not be complete an aquatic poison build without your jellyfish. This says when you use an adjacent aquatic item, this gains haste. So generally what you're doing is you're putting your pufferfish next to your jellyfish so that whenever your pufferfish goes off, it is creating an instance of haste. And generally your pufferfish is going to be the item that's going off the most in these haste-based aquatic poison builds. So this is going to just repeatedly charge your jellyfish, which is repeatedly going to charge your pufferfish and hopefully make a loop of hasting and charging that'll get your pufferfish to go off consistently and as many times as you can in a fight. So talking about some key skills here, obviously every single poison skill that we can get can make sense for an aquatic poison build, but again, we're going to need some form of defense. So we can look at something like Venomous Vitality, which is a diamond tier skill, but it says you have regen equal to half the poison on your enemy. So this skill alone could allow you to try and lean further into the poison stacking and take off some of the defensive items on your board so that you can try and defeat your opponent much quicker than they can you, and then bridging the gap with the amount of regeneration to hopefully win. We can also see something like Paralytic Poison, again, another freeze skill that when you poison, you freeze an item for however many seconds, 2, 3, 4, depending on its rarity, but you need some semblance of defense as a poison build. Just again, thinking about how damage is ticking. Yes, you could be doing 200 poison damage a second, but as we can see in the meta right now, if we're seeing a lot of burst damage builds or builds that can stack on damage very quickly, you need to have something to ensure that you are getting to the point where your poison actually does what it needs to do. So there needs to be some bridging of the gap there. Other than that, we can get like improved toxins or final dose early on from like a gold tier skill event or the gold tier skill option at the beginning of the game that can signal to us that we want to go into this build. But just beware that If you're getting a gold tier skill, Vanessa has the largest item pool now out of all the characters in the game. So this inherently means that she's also the least consistent in terms of getting the items that you want on any character in the game. So you could get this poison skill and then potentially be trapped by not seeing any poison items in your shop. And the poison items are generally ones that are not synergizing with very much else. They're synergizing with like haste, but it's not like a Zoracid where it's going to be synergizing just with any weapon build and you can slot it into anything realistically. Your poison builds are going to have much more specific items they want to utilize. They are small aquatic items, so that is good for your aquatic synergies, but just understand that with the poison builds, you want to ensure that if you get this poison item or get the poison skill early in the game, that you can find or try and aggressively find the poison items to go along with it. So again, going back to our example here, we see that this pufferfish is being enabled by this captain's wheel, which is going to be hasting the catfish and the pufferfish. It's going off 2 times, which means these items are going to be going off very quickly. They also have these different hasting skills where they're gaining crit chance when they're hasting. They haste at the start of combat. When they use their item for the first time, they're hasting, I believe it's 3 aquatic items. So they have a lot of ways to enable haste. They also have a bit of crit chance on their board. They have these different poison skills here, and they also have a little bit of freeze. So they're mixing a good amount of defense with offense. They also are utilizing this Clamora here, which we can see is going to slow, I believe a gold tier Clamora slowing 3 different items at the beginning of the fight for 1 second each. So they have a bit of defense there to try and bridge that gap so that their pufferfish can go off like crazy and so that their catfish can stack up some big numbers. This is also an obsidian catfish, so it's getting damage for how it's scaling with its poisoning. So there is, yeah, a good mix of poison here and also a little bit of direct damage to get them across. So yeah, this build, again, can be very potent. You just have to make sure that you're mixing some defense in with your offense so that your poison can get across the finish line. Now, one of the last major archetypes I want to talk about for Vanessa are the slow builds. So we can see from, I believe this user is Slinkums, this slow build here that is utilizing the slowing from the Sea Dog Saloon as well as from this ray here, the Elusive Ray rather, to put on a ton of slow onto their opponents. That is going to be triggering this proboscis here, which basically says that every time you slow, you're going to be dealing damage. So additionally, they have this mantis shrimp here that's going to scale its damage every time there is an instance of slow. So there's a lot of ways to take advantage of slow on Vanessa now. It's more than just the lighthouse and the dark water anglerfish, but it's also not necessarily as consistent as some of the other builds. But when it goes off, it's maybe one of the more powerful things that you can be doing on Vanessa. That's because it's providing both offense and defense in large volume. Slowing, you can think about it as basically halving the DPS of your opponents. If the item that is being slowed is going to be going off half as fast, so thus it's doing half the amount of DPS. So halving your opponent's DPS is an incredible way to be surviving, but also it allows for your scaling items here with your slow synergies to really go to town. Also, enchanting something like this proboscis with poisoning here will allow it to tick your opponents down, and because their board is so slow, that poison will probably get there. So yeah, can be an incredibly potent build. Looking at some key items here, we're obviously wanting to slow. This is the slow build. So how do we do that? Well, Dock Lines is going to be slowing a lot of our enemies' items. Elusive Ray can put on a tremendous amount of slow. Clamora is going to be slowing at the start of game, and really there's a lot of different slow items available to Vanessa, and there's also the option to find a slowing item as one of the events that you can find within the game. There is also vendors that specifically sell slow items. There's at least 2 that are specifically doing that. So there's a good amount of ways for you to find slow items. And you can also try and get like a Magnus Femur from Mac or something of the nature to really capitalize off of all of that slowing. And other ways that we can do that as well are something like the proboscis. The proboscis says that every time you slow, you're dealing damage. So obviously a great synergy for us. And then something like the lighthouse, as we looked at before, that says every time you're slowing it, you're going to be charging this item. But let's take a closer look at these things. So one of your most potent slow enablers is going to be the dock lines. And there's some really key things to note about it. One is that it has a 5-second cooldown, so it's going off relatively quickly compared to your other slow items. It also is slowing multiple items, which is really big, and it's slowing those items for 3 seconds. A lot of the other items we can look at, like Clamora and things of this nature, are only slowing for 1 second. So to be putting on this amount of slow is a tremendous amount of slow comparatively. Yeah, let's check out that Clamora. So the Clamora, again, it's slowing 1, 2, 3, or 4 items, so that's really strong, and that's slowing multiple items, and we can see that it starts at the beginning of each fight. The downside is that it has a 10-second cooldown, and it's only putting on 1 second of slow. So the Clamor, really, its main use here is, yes, it is slowing, which can be very disruptive towards your enemy's builds, but it's also a bunch of instances of slow that can charge up your items, like the lighthouse. And again, we've seen this here before. When you slow, you're charging at 2 seconds. So this puts on 20 burn, which is a very large amount. If we think about the dark water anglerfish, that is a very similar item, but it ultimately needs to be at gold tier to do this amount of burn. The lighthouse, which the nice part about it is that if you can get it to diamond tier, it's going to go off every 6 seconds. So if you have a Clamora, and let's say you have a diamond tier Clamora and you have a diamond tier lighthouse, well, at the start of the fight, the lighthouse just goes off. And it also has 2 seconds of charge on top of that. So this can be a very potent combo. But a lot of what we're going to see with these builds that's going to help bridge us to getting to something like that end game is with this Illusoray. So the Illusoray says it has an 8-second cooldown, which again, kind of slow, but it's going to slow one item for 1, 2, 3, or 4 seconds. That's decent, but here's the big clause. For each adjacent friend or ray, this has +1 multicast. So generally what's going to happen with your slow builds is that you're going to have like Illusory on board, and you're going to put 2 friends next to it. These friends can look like, she has Calico, Catfish, Darkwater Anglerfish, all these different friends that are going to work very well with the slowing effect, or just work very well with the Illusory rather. And one of those that we can put next to it is like this Mantis Shrimp. And this Mantis Shrimp now is very important, I would say, for Vanessa with these slow synergy builds, because it is another source of slow scaling of damage that you have access to. And before, Vanessa didn't really have a lot of payoffs for the slow build necessarily. You were really trying to get a femur or utilize the lighthouse. But now with Darkwater Anglerfish and now with Mantis Shrimp, you have we have a couple very viable slow targets or slow scalers. We can also think about that old Salt Claw as well. Salt Claw that sees your haste here, or sees your slow rather. So whenever your items are slowing, this is gaining damage, which can be pretty big. We can also see items like Mr. Richardson that see that same clause of when you're slowing, it's going to be gaining shield. So there are pretty good synergies that can go alongside as friends with your Illusoray. But this proboscis is definitely the creme de la creme of what you want. It says when you slow, it's going to deal damage. It's not going to be dealing a lot of damage, so we need to find a way to enable more damage on it. However, it basically is a 1-slot item that can enable all the damage you need on your board from your slow items to defeat your opponent. So if you can think about a lighthouse is a large item. It's taking up 3 slots. This proboscis is 1 item, and it goes off instantaneously every time you're slowing. So you can have 9 other slots completely filled with slow items that are now all basically doing damage just because you had this proboscis on board. But here's the real problem. It is not inherently a Vanessa item. We have to find this through different means. There are 2 monsters in the game that can have the proboscis, the dire mosquito, and the giant mosquito, and it's also something that we can find from Curio. So if you know that you're going to be going into a slow build, you can go to Curio, the junkyard vendor, and potentially find a proboscis. So going back to our example here from Slinkums, we see that they have the mantis shrimp that's scaling again off of the slowing from the Eluceray. They have the Sea Dog Saloon that we looked at earlier, which is going to be hasting and slowing, and then they're taking advantage of that, all that as damage in the proboscis here. So they have two different very good sources of damage scaling along with their slowing. We can also see the figurehead here is going to be reducing the cooldowns of all the items to the left of it that are aquatic, and it's going to be giving damage to all the weapons to the right of it. So pretty good placement here. These are going to be going off very quickly, especially with a diamond tier version of this. And they also have a little bit of crit chance to boot. They also have this skill here which says that every time you slow, this is going to be doing damage. So looking quickly at our slow skills here, there are a bunch that are very good for our items. Thinking about that proboscis specifically, we have that slow and steady, which says when you slow, your weapons are going to be gaining damage. Can also see something like Relax Bro, which says when you slow, you gain regeneration. This can be very potent. Also, this skill here, Paralyzing Rush from the Dire Mosquito, is incredible. It says when you slow, you haste a weapon. So if we have, again, something like an old Saw Claw or a Shark Ray, or even just a single weapon on our board, this can do some insane stuff as it's hasting that one weapon, and we can turn basically our slow build into a one weapon build and have a very hasted cutlass or hasted flagship thing of that nature. So there's a lot of very good slow skills that are specific to our runs that we can try and hunt for. But generally speaking, the slow and steady skill is going to be one of the better ones. So going back again to this slow build here, we can see that they had that diamond slow and steady, so they were really charging up all the damage here, just from all the different instances of slow on their proboscis, even on the Zorsid mantis shrimp. So yeah, very nice build overall here, and the slow build is one of the more fun ones I say that you can do in the Bazaar. And now we've looked at 6 different builds here in the Bazaar, but I want to leave you with 2 special guests, 2 ones that I think are very worthwhile for you to know, but are not necessarily ones that you're going to get every single run or that you should be looking for every single run. And one of these is the Langxian build. When this item says that essentially when you win a fight, it gains more damage, and thus if you start with it early, you can really ramp up your damage very quickly. Getting ways to enable it like the Crow's Nest and Silencer to have a shorter cooldown here can all work very well. Especially seeing that now the Langxian has a 10-second cooldown, and if we can upgrade it as fast as we can, every time we're going to win a fight, it's going to gain more damage. Notably, this does work on monster fights. So if we get the Langxian, we're fighting monsters early and often. Every time we go to the mountain pass, we're trying to fight an additional monster, things like that. This can scale up a tremendous amount of damage very quickly, and it can become a very viable one weapon build. It's also notable that you can get it from the Kyver drone. So this is a day 1 monster fight, and there's a couple day 1 monster fights, but this is one in the rotation here. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different options that you can get from the Kyver drone, and one of them is the Langxian. So if you get the Langxian early, you can pivot into this Langxian build, and then you can ride that all the way to 10 win victory right here. It's also just one of the more fun builds, I'd say, that you can go, because it's just kind of like you know exactly what you're doing. All you're doing, you're just making this Langxian as big as possible. You're putting on as much crit chance, as much cooldown reduction, just to get this thing to be rocking and rolling as quickly as it can. And honestly, it's a pretty viable build, I will say. It sometimes does get stopped by freezing and slowing, but you live by the Lang, you die by the Lang. And the last build I want to leave you with here is the infamous Boulder. This Boulder, man, this is pretty crazy. Also seeing 2 silencers on this thing. Daco 65 here, just getting this thing to go off and try and one-shot their opponent. They have the big numbers skill. They have ways to charge it even more quickly. The juggler skill, they have haste skills, they have crit skills. So when this Boulder goes off, it's going to rock and roll. And if you aren't familiar, the Boulder is a large item. It has a 20 or 16-second cooldown. It has 1 ammo, very notably. You should know that this is the case, and it deals damage equal to your opponent's max health. If they have 100 health, it deals 100 damage. If they have 100,000 health, it deals 100,000 damage. So this item is one that, if you can enable it, is just one of the strongest builds that Vanessa can do, especially if you can get crit chance on it. And I say crit chance is very important because it's doing exactly 100% of the max health of your opponent. So even if they have one more shielding than their max health, this will not kill them. And again, the Boulder only has one ammo. There are ways to put more ammo on it or to reload this ammo, but just note that you're going to want to make sure that when this goes off, that your opponent is not going to be alive. So crit chance, it's going to do double the amount of their max health as damage. So just keep that in mind if you go for this build. And just going back to this, you can see that I think that's an obsidian upgrade here to the Boulder. It has 2 silencers, so it's getting even more cooldown reduction. It's getting hasted. They also have this life preserver to ensure that they don't die. There's so many cool, fun variants of the Boulder that you can do. When I say variants, really all that you're doing is just building up your Boulder to go off as fast as possible. But how you get there is all part of the journey and fun. So yeah, wanted to showcase that build for sure. And yeah, that's 8 archetypes. 8 archetypes, different things that you can be doing on Vanessa specifically. And the fun part here is that we kind of saw that there's a lot of interchangeable pieces. The best part about the Bazaar is you never know what you're going to get when you fire it up, and figuring out how to pivot into any one of these builds or any one of these archetypes is generally what you're trying to do. And now knowing a little bit about what they look like, hopefully you now have the knowledge to go in with a little more confidence into the Bazaar and know what you're looking for here. Again, I think the Langxian and the Boulder are a little more outliers, but on Vanessa, I think all of these 6 builds here are ones that you can semi-consistently get in your runs. It's really on you to see how you can put them together. I'd say the most consistent one is probably the weapon spam build, along with maybe the 1 weapon build. But the problem is that the 1 weapon build kind of gets countered by the current meta, so it's a little more difficult. It's also potentially not as powerful as like an aquatic weapons hasting and slowing build, or maybe not as powerful as like a burn or aquatic poison build. The problem with the aquatic poison build, though, being that it doesn't have a lot of defenses, and the burn build without a powder keg is just not as potent as some of the others. So there's a lot of strengths and weaknesses to all of these. I'd say they're all incredibly viable and ones that I would recommend that you all try out. And I'm also excited to see what builds you guys come up with. I look in the Discord for the Bazaar, for the different archetypes that people are posting and the different builds that they come up with, and I'm always surprised and excited to see what you guys can do. With that, I really appreciate you all watching here. I'll have timestamps down below so that you can go and look at these builds and reference them when you're in your different runs. And yeah, overall, let me know if I've missed anything here, or overall some synergies that that you found that are very powerful with your builds. I'd love to see it genuinely, not even for clickbait or engagement here. I just want to know what you guys have been doing. I've been climbing the ladder and I'm getting closer to being legend yet again, but finding more synergies and how I can pivot and utilize my items most effectively is something that I enjoy the most about this game. All that said, I have been and continue to be the Bazaar Whisperer. I thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, sure, you could subscribe, sure, you could like, sure, you could leave a comment. All of that would be great, but most importantly, I hope you have a good night.